Get started with iOS. I asked earlier, I think almost everyone here is new to iOS, correct? Is there anyone who already has experience? Oh, so Dave, see you again. A couple. Hopefully you'll learn some good things here too. Some pitfalls we've seen over the years and things to get you started smoothly and easily. So let's just jump right in. We'll have Q&A at the end of the day. Please, if you have any questions and we don't have time for the QA, come by and talk with me afterwards, okay? I said I'm the director of Modev Academy. ModevDC is going to be starting to have classes. Rather than also have conferences, we're also going to have focused classes for iOS, Android, Windows 8, HTML5, and 10, both for beginners and for advanced. So if you're already experienced on these platforms and you want to get more knowledgeable, no one knows everything about everything, especially when it comes to certain areas. IDEs, working with the system for uploading it to whatever services you have. So we think that there's a really good niche to give some nice training for this. Our first set of classes will start, knock out the volume. First set of classes will start in January specifically for iOS. These are going to be one-day classes that you can string together if you want. Getting started, Objective-C, Advanced Xcode. Xcode's the IDE that you'll hear about today. Also, I hate it when people spend time writing down URLs, which I'm going to give you today. Don't bother writing down the URLs. Write down this one. Everything that I mentioned today will be on this site. It's at gomodev.com, Modev Academy resources. So that way I don't have to spend time stopping and having you write it. Everyone have that written down? Some of the slideshows that we're going to present today will be up on the website. We're actually having 4 classes today for iOS and 3 for Android. So let's get started. The talk today we're going to go over about starting up with Apple, how to create an application, and testing and publishing your application, and also where to learn more information. And hopefully this is the only time I'm going to be reading this slide. So how do you get started with Apple? Well, the first thing you have to do is get a Mac. I'm sorry for those Windows users, but there is absolutely no way to develop native applications on the Macintosh or Mac clone. Now, you can do third-party SDKs, which are cross-platform, and develop on those other platforms using something like Unity, something like Titanium, but at some point you're going to have access to the Mac for installing it up on Apple's site for doing code signing and such. So unfortunately, you're going to have to start with that. Now the next thing to do is to get an Apple ID. Apple IDs are the way that Apple knows who you are. Every time you get a new Macintosh or a new iOS, you automatically get registered with a new Apple ID. For those of you in the Windows world or Linux or whatever other platforms you're working on, you'll have to do this at start. The one thing I tell you about Apple IDs is don't get more than one. Don't think you're going to have one for your home use and one for your development use. It's a unique ID, and it's connected to your code signing, to your applications that you've purchased. So the worst thing in the world you want to do is to use different IDs, because then you'll have an iOS device you can't develop for because it uses a different Apple ID. So please, don't go the mistake of when you're registering thinking, oh, I'll get one Apple ID for the whole company. The Apple IDs are tied to people. If someone else comes on your company, you have to exchange the purpose of what they're doing, what's called the team task. You can change that, with one exception I'll get into at the end, okay? So please, go ahead and get an Apple ID. The next step you have to do is sign up for the Apple Developer Program. The Apple Developer Program costs $99, $99 for the iOS, $99 for the Macintosh. It's a yearly fee. It gives you access to all the development tools, all the SDKs, all the documentation. It also gives you access to the developer forum, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. It also will give you 2 tech support questions. If you actually find something so difficult that no one knows how to do it, you don't know how to do it, you can't have a forum get it, you can actually send this question over to Apple. It's about a $250 cost if you were to buy tech support questions later on. Now in a given year, I average about 1 question I ask on that level. So come end of your year, you can actually transfer it to other people. So there's a lot of them swapping around. It's kind of fun. So that's the second step, or excuse me, the third step. I mentioned the access to the SDK, tech support questions. Oh yeah, it's also where you get your access to your beta software. This is the only way, if you're interested in testing out software for new updates or new SDKs, which occasionally you do, this is the only way to get it. Now, Apple does not allow you to publish with beta software or beta SDKs. The exception of this is, like 3 weeks before a new SDK or a new iOS is about to come out, they'll say, use the Golden Master to get it in the store for release. But otherwise, the only reason you use the SDK is to test for new things, and some of the new IDEs like Xcode has features which are nice to develop with. So you can actually develop with the old version. Oh yeah, it's the only way also to have access to the conferences. Worldwide Developer Conference is Apple's main conference once a year. You have to be a member in order to sign up for it. But they also have other conferences all during the year, what they call mini tech talks. And that's the only way to sign up is if you're an Apple developer. Those ones are for free. Oh, sorry, there's no more hardware discounts. They used to give us a discount where we could buy a computer really inexpensive developer. Apple quit doing that. Tools. What are the tools you need to actually develop? Well, there's 3 answers to that. Xcode, Xcode, Xcode. That is the only IDE, the only development system that you'll have to learn, and it covers everything. There will be a talk this afternoon about getting Xcode and exactly the features. But Xcode is the required, it's free, it's available in the Apple Mac Store. All you have to do is go on and register it. Now, if you want to get a beta version of it, there's an area that you can download it, but generally, most people just get it right from the store. There's a little bit of misinformation about this. Apple has always had it be free. Sometimes it used to be on DVDs. When they switched online, they said, oh, it costs $100 to download. One time, they had to do a $5 fee if you weren't a developer. Apple does not make money off of this, so it's readily available. Am I going too fast, or is this about too much information for you?
It's good.
Okay, just want to make sure. I said it's the only IDE because it does everything for you. It's a built-in project manager. It's a syntax-aware auto-completion editor. That basically means you type in the word and it fills it out for you. The compiler and linkers. Interface builder, that's the user interface. That used to be a separate application. It's built into it now. A very good symbolic debugger. You can actually set breakpoints that are executed only on certain instances, complex code. Source revision, everyone use Git or SVN, a built-in Git SVN client. The help system, we'll talk more about the help system in a few minutes. It's all built in. And finally, this is the way you co-sign and you upload your application to the App Store. Now, you still can do the uploading separately if you want to, but you really have no reason to. It's the only way to code sign. And code sign is how you get your applications out, for either for distribution to testers or distributions when you're finally selling it. This is the editor. I just wanted to show it to you, Xcode. When I said it was a project manager, that means this is the thing that takes all your files together, whether they're artwork, sound, source code, frameworks, and manages it. Not only that, but you can now have more than one project managed in what's called a workspace, so you can share code between it. You edit it in one spot and automatically gets updated somewhere else. You can see the the editor in the middle right there, syntax aware. Everything's colored for the different pieces, gives you errors as you type. It's one of the better ones that I've ever come across. Easily comparable to Eclipse or Java Bean. And then finally over on the right-hand side, incredible richness of tools to help you get through in configurations. More than anything else, setting your iOS application is probably going to be the one of the things that drives you more crazy than actually writing the code. Okay. Now there are some other software tools that are worth knowing about and worth using. These first two are built into the Xcode system. You get them when you first purchase or download the product. iOS Simulator. You can release products without ever owning an iOS. You ever own an iPhone or an iPad. The simulator is pretty good. The only times it ever falls down if you're really touching bare bones. on the metal of the device. For example, if you're doing something to do with location awareness, the GPS isn't there. If you're doing something that has a camera, like there's no built-in camera. But for almost 80%, 90% of the other applications, you can go all the way through the development process just using the simulator. Instruments. Now, I mentioned the source level debugger in Xcode. Instruments is the most powerful performance tool I've ever come across. We're still learning all the things we can do. It checks for memory management, it checks for OpenGL, for performance, for speed, for footprint. That's the way you decide exactly make your device, your application, tweaked to high performance. You will at some point have to have a graphic editor. The iPad and the iPhone are incredibly graphically oriented. You have an artist giving you artwork. You will have to change the artwork at some point for different levels of resolution. For example, if you're going out and starting right now and you say, oh, I need to have an icon, go out and tell your artist, give me an icon at 512 by 512. Does anyone think we're actually going to use a 512 by 512 icon in your application? No, but Apple requires that size for the website that advertises your application. So don't create the artwork at 72 dots per inch pixel size, because then you're going to zoom it up and it's going to look terrible. So almost all of your art really should be resolution independent. On top of which, Apple's coming out with new devices. I'd hate to have you have an application now and have the artwork created, and then Apple comes up with a new Retina display which has double the dots per inch for pixels, which is exactly what happened 2 years ago. And some people had old artwork and they didn't know how to update it. So you don't get the advantage. So have all your artwork pixel size independent. Secondly, if someone gives you the artwork who's your artist, you're going to have to convert it to PNG. PNG is the common iOS, iPad art format. You can work with JPEG. We don't really recommend it. Apple actually takes the PNG and compresses it a little bit. So the slight differences in size between a PNG and a JPEG or a TIFF, don't worry about. Same reason you should have a sound editor. You're going to be changing, hopefully all your applications will have sounds. If it's nothing more than good clicks or good feedback for controls, you probably should get a good sound editor. When you ship the application, you'll be working with something called iTunes Connect. There is an iTunes Connect application for free from Apple's website that will allow you to chart the sales. There's also some applications from third parties which will chart the purchases and your inventory of devices. It's really useful. Apple does that on the website, gives you this information, but they give you it individually for every single country you work with, which means at the end of the month it's very difficult to tabulate all this information. To fix this problem, there are iTunes Connect applications from third parties. And the last is Git and Subversion. You said you use SVN? Which would you prefer, Git or SVN? Git. Good for you. Version control. This is a fairly recent development from Apple. They do it very well. They first went with one for SVN, commonly called Subversion, Turtle Subversion, Apache Subversion. They added Git. It is a way of handling your archiving. It's a way of handling version controlling. It's a way of handling merging for a group of people, more than one programmer. With this, you can actually have two people working on the same file, the same procedure, and not have any conflict. Now, there is a conflict if we're both working on the same line of code, and in which case there's a very great merge tool that pops up and says which one is the right version that you should grab. I recommend that for individual users. I recommend it for teams. It's stupid to not do it with a team. Individual, I still think it's a great idea. Now, the built-in for Xcode is exceptional about managing and merging. It's not that good for tweaking some of the things. If you didn't turn the Git on to begin with and you had to add Git, if you had to grab a file from a different source, you plugged it in and you forgot to add it the right way, there are no tools to fix the problem. So you're going to have to learn how to use the Git or SVN command line. And it is on every Macintosh has this, so don't worry about purchasing it. But just be aware that you're going to have to learn a little bit. I'd recommend Git. Git is the technically more sophisticated one. Functionally, they're almost the same. Oh, and in any instances, you're going to have a server. That's the actual server you connect with. Now, you can run a server on your local machine. You can run a server on any IP that gives that service. But most people go through some inexpensive. Google Code and GitHub do it for free if it's a open source. Otherwise, they charge you a little bit. XPDev is the one I actually prefer for commercial. Those are the software tools. There is also online tools. The online tools is a fancy way of saying Apple's websites. There is the developer member center. This is the place that you log into with your Apple ID after you've got a developer account, and it gives you access to everything. This is where the places where you go to get new versions of the software. This is the place where you set up accounts, adding other people from your team. So it also is one of probably the best place to get into the other systems. Every page links to every page, and they're not very consistent. I like to go in through this front end. Once you've logged onto the system, the Dev Center is where all the documentation is. It tells you about downloading the beta version, mentioned up there, new software. It's where the developer library is. It's where the sample code is. A lot of this is duplicated on the documentation in the Xcode itself, but a lot of people like going to the website to grab the information because then you can have multiple pages open at the same time. The other area that you're going to get really used to is the provisioning profile. This is one of the two areas that's going to drive you crazy. This is the piece of the code on Apple server where you set up the application ID, the user IDs, and the provisioning profiles that you need in order to run the software on your devices for testing. It's also the place where you set up the IDs that's actually going to be shipped. Every application out there has an app ID. Apple heavily recommends a reverse domain name because the app IDs are shared for everyone in the world. So you'll start using your com.blank name of your application as your ID. It's also used IDs for everything from iCloud to Game Center. So start getting used to using your reverse domain name. This site here, you set up the person's certificate, the application ID, and then create a provisioning profile. My partner Duncan will be able to talk about later today a little more details about this area. Now, let's say you've done and tested your application, you got the provisioning profile set up, you're ready to push it out for people to actually purchase it. Then you go to iTunes Connect. First of all, this is the area where a lot of your licenses and Apple documentation is. Every once in a while they'll change some sort of agreement. This is the spot where you have to have your administrator sign up for your company and say, yes, I'll follow these rules. This is the place where you upload your application. This is the place where you edit the metadata. This is the place where you set up your Game Center or your iCloud. So this area here is one of the two ones that will drive you crazy. Every application gets shipped out there has metadata that you have to get just right for it to get shipped. I mentioned one other thing, that's the bank account. Who here is shipping applications that are going to be free? Well, everyone else is for pay. Great. You're going to need a bank account. And this is the point where Apple asks you for your tax ID number. This is either be personal or corporate. And because all your sales are not going to be in the US, the majority of your sales are actually going to be overseas, according to most statistics, you'll get international bank transfers. Now, let's say you sell an application and you sell one in Finland, and Finland sends you 99 cents. If your bank charges $5 for charge, you've just lost money. We had people who did that. So please get a bank that does not charge you money. There are some. I prefer Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo set up. Oh yeah, your bank has to be international. So forget Chevy Chase or Chevy Chase now, Capital One. Okay. So it has to be a bank that does business outside the United States. So double check about that. Okay, that's how to start getting things you need to set up before you first done your first line of code. Now let's talk about actually programming and what you need to write an application. There are 5 building blocks. First of all, you have to learn Objective-C. You have to learn the frameworks. You have to learn about user interface, and that's actually 2 different things. You have to learn about design patterns. Does anyone familiar with the term design patterns? Okay. Design patterns is a name for something that we've been doing for 15 years before they came up with a name. The gang of four who came up with the concept of design patterns, they said, oh, everyone's doing these things, let's put them together and explain them. And it was a great thing because now we know how to explain this. Before that, it was just, this is the way you did things. The fifth thing is the submission process, which I explained earlier is a little complex. So you have to learn these 5 things in order to get them out the door. The first one is Objective-C. Objective-C is a high-level programming language. It's a subset of C, and it has no relations to C++. Arguably, it's actually older than C++, just by a hair. It includes everything in C. It actually includes C++. So you can have C++ code and Objective-C code merged, and there are a couple of real good reasons to do that. Unity, for example, has C++ basis. If you're doing code that moves between other platforms, the user interface and the main portion of the code will be in Objective-C, but then you can add C++ for adding certain libraries or features. It also has C11, which is the latest version of ANSI-C. It includes a language compiler and runtime and a memory management system. They've just come out with ARC, which is the most wonderfulest thing I've ever seen for memory management. And we'll go into detail more about that later this afternoon. That's about 30% of your program is learning how to do Objective-C. By the way, Objective-C is identical for both Macintosh and iOS. So if you get a book that talks about Objective-C, they'll talk there's slight feature difference, but not very much. The next part is the frameworks. This is the other 30% you're going to have to learn in order to do this. Every development system in the world nowadays has a user interface frameworks that's completely separate from language, and iOS is no different. It's a grouping of related objects and headers. The main ones you have to learn is the foundation class. Foundation class is a lot like standard libraries in C++. It's the thing you use to manage data, arrays, dictionaries, which is a fancy name for indexes, sets, other main common computer concepts. Once you learn that, the UI kit, that is actually Cocoa Touch. That's the user interface of iOS, iPad, and iPhone. There's also Core Data. That's the new front end for data manipulation for storage. At the back end is SQLite. Core Data is really connected to the UI kit, which makes grabbing information for displaying in views much easier. Now, other than that, though, everything in the SDK is a framework. There are frameworks for address book. There's a framework for the camera, for the video, GPS, sound, QuickTime movies. The list goes quite core location. What else did I miss? So you get the idea. You have to learn these frameworks. Now, if you started out and just use the UI kit and foundation, you can ship your application right there. It's when you start adding more and more. We just added Facebook support. That's a new framework. We had social media support. That's a new framework. So you'll start learning these one by one. All of them, though, are based on stuff in the foundation kit, and then kind of communicate with the UI kit for user interface. After frameworks, again, just a layered approach for frameworks. Oops. You can see the UI kit is almost the top level. What did I mention here? This is not my slide. Oh yeah, core graphics, OpenGL. Anyone program in OpenGL? Okay, it's fairly common, not even just for games. OpenGL ES, that's a integer-based version of OpenGL. Similar ideas in the full OpenGL. It's fairly common on handheld devices. User interface is actually two different things. Learning how to create a good application and learning what makes a good application. Because if I learn how to create buttons and windows and views and I make it look terrible, I'm not going to sell my product. The user interface on the iOS devices, unless you're doing everything yourself like an OpenGL, is going to be based on Interface Builder. This is built into the Xcode, and so what you see is what you get editor, where you actually put components together and then you link them together so that you know this component button is pressed makes this call to the source code. It's all graphically, it's very nice. You'll have to understand that. Of all the features of Xcode, this is probably the easiest one to understand, which is good. So learn about that immediately. Next thing is how to prototype your device. Now, remember I told you about the tools we have? Software tools, online tools. The biggest tool you'll probably have is a piece of paper and a pencil. It's called paper prototyping. Make a storyboard of what you want your application to do. Design it before you start coding. There are lots of books on this subject. Apple releases videos on the subject. When they start the developer conference, the talk on prototyping is the second talk they do after what's new. So it's very important. Do not make your application based on some ideas you've thrown together and you just start coding. Truthfully, if you're first starting out in the iOS, you're not that good enough to do that yet. So please, learn to prototype, learn to understand what consistency means, user interface. It's a teeter board. On the one hand, you want your applications to look really good and to stand out, but on the other hand, you don't want to look so different that the user doesn't know what to do with it. So consistency is very important. Design patterns. Design patterns are techniques. This takes about 20% of your code. If I say model view controller, does anyone here know what that means? Some of you, okay. All of the user interface is based on the model view controller model or design pattern. You have your view, which is the user interface. You have your data stored over here, and then you have your controller. Model is a different name for data. And then you have a controller, which is actually the application that controls all of them together. Generally, when you subclass an object, you're subclassing the controller object for a view or other types of data. That is just one major design. Another one that's very common is delegate. You don't make a subclass of certain objects. Instead, you instantiate that object, and then that object makes calls to your delegate. We'll go into a little more detail about that during my Objective-C class. These design patterns were pioneered by the book on design patterns that came out about 10 years ago. There is a really good book on Cocoa design patterns, and any other book you have, if it doesn't talk about design patterns in the beginning of the book to get you started, go look for another book. Other common design patterns are target action. We'll talk about that in the Cocoa C class, but every object can get a message. And when you press a button, the button calls the code by saying, here's my target, my object, here's the action, the method I want to call. So that type of linking you have to understand. Singleton shared objects. Shared object is a fancy name for a single object that all the different parts of your program communicate with. For example, sound is usually a separate sound object. That way, your game can call the sound to play it, as well as your buttons when you press can call it. If each one had their own sound, separate object, you'd have conflict. It's a nice way of handling it. Cocoa is based on these design patterns, and you must learn them. And we'll stop it for that. And the last thing is how do you submit the applications. I've already mentioned this in a little more detail. To submit an application is a combination of using Xcode and iTunes Connect. You create a provisioning profile based on app IDs and tester IDs. Now this is only for the testing portion. You have to know everyone who's going to be testing it. You have to know everyone's device. You can have up to 256 separate devices registered for your testing. When you release it, you also have to have a provisioning profile so that Apple knows what your application and what the app ID is for all work together. You also have to go to iTunes Connect to upload the metadata, which is everything from the artwork to telling it, this application uses the iCloud, this application uses Game Center, this application uses in-app purchases. Everyone's familiar with the freemium model? That's why a lot of people are making money right now, by having in-app purchases for a free application. Finally, when you're all done with all of this, Xcode uploads the tune for iTunes Connect, and you wait. If you're lucky, it gets turned around in 2 days. If you're less lucky, they come back to you within 2 weeks. If you're very unlucky, it comes back to you and says, here are the problems. Code problems actually is the least common issue you have. Occasionally, Apple will come around and says, this is an inappropriate application. That happens. Vast majority of times, you did not set up the metadata correctly. So you have to go back, find out what's wrong, and resubmit it again. As I said, this area will probably drive, for the first-time users, is what will drive you crazy. This is also the reason we're getting a lot of clients who say, I went out and hired someone to write my application for him, and he gave it to me, and now I don't know what to do. And I say, well, you're going to have to dedicate someone, either hire me as a consultant or hire someone on your staff who's going to be spending a certain amount of times. And this amount of time can vary depending on how many updates you have, like new content, new artwork. So someone on your staff is going to have to do this for you. Don't think you can get an application completely designed by someone in-house or out-house and then not be able to worry about it and just put it in the store. It's a process where you're going to be working back and forth. For beginning users, this is one that's going to pull your hair more than anything else. Learning more. iOS is very active. Objective-C gets updated every year. New SDKs, new APIs come out every year. Now you can write an application, leave it there, backward compatible. But if you want an application that keeps update with new features, you're going to have to learn the new stuff. We'll go in more detail on some of the other classes. I'm going to talk about some places where you can learn, and all these references are going to be up on that website I gave you earlier. Okay. First of all, books. I divide books up into 3 areas: references and documents, tutorial and cookbooks, and then books on design books. References, one that gives you every API in the world, everyone that gives you all the information. If you find a book that has only this, don't buy it. Apple updates the software. Your book is going to be obsolete within 6 months. It's probably obsolete beyond the shelf. I've gone any book that's older than 3 years, don't bother buying it. Built into Xcode is a very good help system where all the documentation that Apple has on the system is downloaded. If it changes, Apple automatically downloads you through Xcode. So there is no reason to have a book that has nothing but calls, because you already have it. And you have it built into your code. You start typing the name of the procedure, on the right-hand side pops up the explanation of what that procedure is. You need to remember what the parameters are, or the result. So don't bother buying a book. Now, having said that, my partner yells at me because he actually likes books to have in hand. You don't need it, is my point. The next area is tutorial and cookbooks. Again, we're having a problem with them being obsolete, but there are some good cookbooks out there. Cookbooks are ones that say, here's the thing, I'm not going to explain you what's happening behind the scenes, but here's the step-by-step process to do a specific task. There is a very good cookbook for core animation, which there's 3 or 4 areas that Apple's documentation is rather poor. Core animation is one, core data is another one. So there are books on these subjects. They're pretty good. Design books, I already told you about the Cocoa book, Cocoa Design Patterns. I recommend that one highly. But the point I'm making is if you go in the bookstore and you pick up a book and you look at it, and you look through it and you see, oh, this one gives me features for this cookbook, it talks about these design patterns, see if you like the writing, go ahead and buy it. But don't get one that's strictly reference or that doesn't explain these things to you, because it's not worth it. Conferences. I've already mentioned Worldwide Developer Conference. The good news is you can sign up for this. The bad news is last year it sold out in 3 hours. And the worst news is it's $1,500. Having said that, people go to them, they sell out in 3 hours. The conference is 5 days of intense training from Apple, all the new APIs. They have user labs where you bring your application in and they will actually test it and look at it and have an expert say, this is great, this sucks, here's your problem, here's what you should change. They also have engineers who spend, let's say you do an application, this video. You will actually meet the guys who do the video code and have them sit down and look at your application. If you have problems, explain the API. That's the best reason, in my opinion, is the engineering labs. Apple videotaped it for years. Now, they've been having WWDCs, one name for 30 years. They've started taping them, and the tapes and videos are now available as part of your membership within weeks of the conference. Some people are saying the conferences aren't worth going to for the cost. San Francisco is a major city. It's expensive to stay there for a week. Depends on your budget. I'd recommend sending, if you have a team of people, I'd recommend sending at least one person. Now, Apple's Tech Talks, these are irregular, not planned, but Apple comes out with new technology. They sometimes do a road show where they'll go to 3 locations on the East Coast, 2 on the West Coast, Brazil, Europe, Asia. And these conferences are free, one-day conferences. Last one I went to was in 2011 in New York City. You can only sign up for those with Apple Developer Conferences if you are an Apple developer, and I highly recommend them. And there's third-party training. We're not the only ones who are going to be training. There's Big Nerd Ranch, there's a number of other trainings. Yes, go to them if you can. Even if you're an experienced user, sometimes they're worth going to just to see other views. I mentioned the videos. Apple has videos online in their what's called the iTunes University. There's the WWDC videos. They're the videos that the Tech Talk was based on. They're not actually filming the Tech Talks, but they're kind of doing something for that. Also, Stanford University. Stanford was the very first place that started teaching iOS programming. MIT could argue that, but they're the very first ones to put all their videos online. There's a gentleman there. Go to keyword Stanford iOS. And surprisingly, there are a lot of independent developers out there who say, hey, here's something I learned, I'm going to show it, and they make YouTube videos. So if you ever have a question about a specific thing, go check it out on YouTube. Someone might have made the video for it. Forums. This used to be not worth it. Now it's fantastic. If you have a question and it's very strange and none of your local friends know how to do it, and you're sure no one has ever come across this before, no, someone's come across it before. Someone's probably come across it before and asked a question on the forum. The Apple Developer Forum is only available for Apple developers. It's worth going to. It's by far the best one. They started it up, and it's like anything else in the world. They started it up, and it was poor for a while. And then Apple dedicated resources. They have 5 or 6 engineers whose sole task is to answer questions on the developer forum now. The Stack Overflow, that's the one that's in general for all levels of programming, but you can search for just iOS. My partner is rather partial for the Apple iOS Developer Forum there. And if you're doing games specifically, iDev Games is a good source. They have a lot of OpenGL ES questions there. This is the Apple iOS Developer Forum I mentioned before. This forum, you have to log in like all of this Member Center, enter your password. But once you're in using your Apple ID for both Mac and for developers, and it's a pretty good search engine. The other site is Stack Overflow that I mentioned before. Again, similar format. Both of them, though, suffer sometimes that the search engine isn't the best in the world. Use Google. You can actually Google search your question. Google search your question, you'll find either in one of the forums, or occasionally you'll find some lone developer somewhere who had this thing and he said, oh, I'm going to write it up, and he puts it on his website with 4 other things. And Google will find it for you, a question that you hadn't thought of. The problem with web resources is they're constantly changing. They're constantly out of date. They're constantly being dropped, and they're constantly being added without the search engines knowing about it. So right now, the only way I know of keeping track of that is Google. Or, excuse me, some other search engine. I am slightly biased. Who uses Bing? Yahoo for a while was popular, but that kind of died. Because everything's changing as a developer, your main goal will be keeping up to date. If you're a Fortran programmer and the latest version of Fortran is Fortran 77, you really don't have to go out and do much training. If you're a programmer for iOS, which is changing every year, don't expect your knowledge set to be good and permanent. You're not going to have to learn anything new. You're going to constantly have to do new stuff. The advantage is you're getting new stuff. You're going to be able to do things no one else has ever seen before. Disadvantage is it's going to take time. Now, I'm kind of near the end of my talk here, and we'll go to the Q&A. Here are the other sessions. There's an Android development done by Adrian. He's a very knowledgeable Android programmer. My partner is going to be doing the intro to Xcode shortly. And then after lunch, I'll come back for Objective-C and the frameworks, while Adrian will be doing a Java Essentials, and then publishing. If you're doing Android, in some ways I'd almost recommend the Android application publishing more than iOS. Android, you have to worry about where you're publishing. At least for iOS, you're publishing on one platform. I'm going to mention a couple things I didn't get into the slide. I keep on saying iOS. What I mean is iPhone, iPad, iPad mini. You can write an iPhone application and the iPhone application will automatically be resized for the other two applications. You can write an iPad application that will only run on the iPad and the iPad mini because its framework and its size is only appropriate for that. And you can write applications that are smart enough to do both. So that's the first step, is to decide what your platform you're targeting it for. And again, my name is Steve Sheets, so I'd like to open it for Q&A. Got 10 minutes of any questions you have. Yes, phone gap. Yes, it's very viable. Phone gap, titanium. They changed the name from Phone Gap for what it was shortly. I forgot the other name. Let me talk about that. I love Q&A because it allows me to add new slides. I prefer applications that are native applications because then you can use all the advantage. Whenever you're doing a third-party SDK, it's a common denominator user interface. Now, having said that, it's a great tool for certain platforms. If your application is content is the most important thing. I believe USA Today uses some kit, I forget which one. If it's the content's the most important part and the user interface consistency between different platforms is important, it's a perfect environment to do. If you're writing a game, games are half of, the majority of the applications that make money are the games, unfortunately, right now. So if you're writing games, writing it in something like Unity, where the game is written and then moved to different platforms, is very viable. It doesn't eliminate you having at some point to use Xcode. It doesn't eliminate you at some point having to understand the Apple's submission process. But yeah, go right ahead.
Is there an equivalent where I can start with my iOS and Xcode and go to Android?
No, unfortunately. The iOS and Objective-C, we'll go into more detail in my Objective-C talk, but Objective-C is unique to the Macintosh and the iOS because there's some runtime features that no one else has bothered to implement. So you cannot write an Objective-C and then port your code to Android. Now, you can port the concepts, you can port the artwork, you can port number crunching if you wrote an Objective-C++ or C. For example, some of you I mentioned before, I used to be the senior programmer over at AOL. I was the one who designed the first Macintosh. I worked there for 3 years on the Mac team and then switched over to the Windows team, not because I was a Windows expert, but I was going to take all my algorithms and ideas and move it to the Windows platform under a second person who was the Windows expert. So that's the same thing. You will take your concepts, your artwork, your localization, that's the text language you work with, and you will be able to move it that way. Does that answer your question?
Is there an application that does that, or do I just sort of manually pick up the pieces?
Manually pick up the pieces. I have yet to see any. There has been a couple attempts, and none of them have worked out. Now, the more common thing right now is surprisingly JavaScript. JavaScript is being used as the common language in the majority of the cross-platform toolkits. Titanium uses it.
So for a starting developer, would you recommend that I start by...
That's not a technical question. That's a marketing question. Apple is the 800-pound gorilla. You will make money. Right now, if someone was a new mobile developer, I'd say write for the Google App Store and maybe Windows 8 and none of the other ones, because none of the other ones have made any money. So, and you'll still make more money on the iOS. Now, the problem with the iOS, of course, is that the iOS store is filled with applications. So the other ones are a little more open. That's not a technical question. Back first.
When you refer to framework, is it just a set of APIs?
Yeah, as long as you realize there's a framework of APIs, runtime, libraries, artwork, and a few other things. It's actually a physical file that you link into your application.
So when you say switch to something like PhoneGap, then you're completely learning a new set of a new framework.
Oh no, that's different. That's a completely, yes. Yes, you're learning, well, you're switching for PhoneGap. Very few of them are actually written in Objective-C. So you're actually learning a new language and a new user interface. A Cocoa Touch is a framework, it's a user interface, If you're switching to PhoneGap, you'll have to use the PhoneGap's user interface. Now you can write your own frameworks. I've written frameworks to do something and then give it to 2 or 3 other people. It's a way of writing code and then abstracting it.
I was just curious about your opinion on what you think is, I guess, less headaches from a coding perspective, doing like a PhoneGap thing in HTML5 and JavaScript, or just making native apps for each, I guess, platform.
What's your background? If you are familiar with HTML5 and Android, that's not a bad approach. The problem with PhoneGap and Titanium is if it isn't in the API, you can't do it unless you're willing to write the code that goes between it. There is starting to be a thriving market for these type of extensions. Specifically Titanium, you're starting to see it. Titanium is, in my opinion, better than PhoneGap, where it gives you more. PhoneGap's a little more easier to work with. We've had talks, I believe there are going to be talks tomorrow on this exact subject in the past. The PhoneGap people have come by Titanium people have come by numerous times, PhoneGap people have done a few times, so I can't give you a better answer than that. I wish I could. You had a question? Okay.
Could you give like a 1, 2, 3 kind of steps as to what would be the best approach to getting started, assuming that you have a programming background too?
Well, I thought I did that at the beginning of the talk.
Well, no, I was saying that if you have like would you say that you get?
Oh, if you've done all the things I've mentioned in the beginning about getting everything set up and you are starting to learn, you got a couple of attempts. You can either go to a training class where a training class, for example, I'm going to give an Objective-C class this afternoon that's 1 hour. That's going to be a whole day-long class with people in front of their computers in a month. So in some ways, if you have the location, willing to pay the fees, going to a class is the best way to get started, especially if they're ones who will actually watch you code, because the book and the reality don't always match. First of all, Apple changes something and there's no books out for it. So that's one approach. The other approach is to get a good book. There's also user groups. Everyone here goes to ModevTC? It's the local user group. We have talks where once a month on marketing, once a month on technical. You have questions, ask other people. No one should program by themselves. That's a recipe for frustration.
Any book you would recommend to get started?
I'm not up to date on the iOS programming in 21 days type of books, okay? So no, I can't recommend that. I recommend Cocoa Design Patterns as a academic things you need to know book, and good luck after that. I'm sorry.
Let's say you were doing this for the first time and you wanted to just create a dummy calendar, a clock, something just you could simple the program. What's your budget for time and what's your budget for? Okay,
now there are lots of documentations by Apple that are more than technical references where they'll take you exactly through these steps. Go to the Apple website, it's there, it'll take you 2 hours to write one.
Okay.
So that is very fast.
Well, I'm saying let's blow through all the way to, say, the development standpoint. How much time should I take? I've never touched Apple development.
Are you familiar with object-oriented programming?
Well, yeah.
Okay, I was assuming everyone was object-oriented programming. If that was a bad assumption, I'm sorry. That is the basis of modern programming nowadays. You can write a stupid, simple hello world application in an hour and a half.
Okay.
You can then spend a day or two learning about Apple's submission process and then spend 2 weeks trying to get it submitted if you get frustrated and miss something.
Okay.
So have someone help you who's done it before. Have someone, a good reference for that.
Okay.
I really can't answer your question because it's technical of how long it takes to do the programming.
Okay.
The Xcode, which Duncan will talk about, has template files for, I want to create an object, a view, user interface. They also have template files, I want to create these projects. And it will do everything for creating the project, and you compile it and it runs.
Okay.
And that will take about 5 minutes. It's learning the steps beyond that will take you time.
Can you talk a little about testing? You just barely mentioned it.
Yes, testing. You contact your friends who you want to test with. You get their Apple ID of the device, the device ID. You enter it in the provisional portal, you compile your application for distribution for testing, and you email it to them, and they either use Xcode or they'll use iTunes application and installs on their machine. Or you use something called Test Flight, which just came out this year, which does it for you, and it's not on the website. We should do it. Thank you for mentioning that for you. Test Flight will automate a lot of this process. They will automate getting the device ID to you. It will not automate you having to enter this information in the provisioning profile. But once you've done this, we've compiled it, when you create the application, you can then upload it to Test Flight, and Test Flight will distribute it for you. So that's the way of going about doing it. In the red.
My question is from design perspective. What approach would you recommend for prototyping iOS apps?
We used to use 3x5 index cards and actually create a slideshow of you press this button, you go to this, and you go to that. That's called paper prototyping. It's fairly good a technique. Now, when they came out with the iPad, we started getting pads that were that sized for the same reason. I'd recommend physically writing on a piece of paper what you want it to look like, and then walk over to someone and demonstrate it to them while keeping your mouth shut. Anyone's taking classes on user testing? The hardest thing for a developer to do is watch someone test your application and use it wrong and not correcting them, because they're not wrong, you're wrong for designing it that way. It's really difficult. That's what I'd recommend doing. And some people do testing without ever writing the code first, for exactly what I just described, prototyping.
But for high fidelity or functional prototyping?
Okay, now user interface prototyping you can actually do in Interface Builder. You can actually set up the user interface and in certain instances run it right there. Having said that, I've seen people who've experimented with some of these tools. Not worth it, really. Most of the tools, at least for the iOS and the Mac world, just aren't worth it. I've known people who've prototyped it using PowerPoint, and that seemed to be a little silly to me. And right there, sir.
You mentioned a lot of apps sometimes getting rejected for mostly non-technical reasons.
Yeah.
Are there ever instances where people put a lot of effort into something and they butt heads with Apple as far as
Yes, Apple does not allow X-rated applications. It does not allow hate mail. This all comes under terms of service, and there's a very large document for terms of service. You can't complain about the terms of service. Apple's upfront about that. You can complain about them inconsistently enforcing it, and that's the only leg you have to stand on when you complain about with Apple. And generally, if you're breaking terms of service, no one has sympathy for you. I didn't mention there is a small community of cracked iPhones and iPhone applications. Don't take it seriously. If you're doing it for money, for application cost, don't go after the bricked market. It's just not worth it. What's the time? I think we're coming up. 5 more minutes.
Can you put back up the resources?
Certainly.
Link? And in terms of local groups, you mentioned ModevEast. Meetup.com has lots of links.
Yes, there are. Local junior colleges have classes that are fairly inexpensive. Meetup has been a wonderful resource for that. Can you read that? Okay, go on, Duncan. This is my partner, Duncan Chapney. He'll come up here. Let me continue the Q&A if there's any, and go ahead and install. Everyone got the thing so we can switch here? Okay. Question for you, did you find this useful? This is the first time we've given this talk. Okay, good. Any recommendations, please give it to me. Modev Academy is a very new process. We now have technically 3-4 people who are going to be doing it full time come January.
Does everybody have this URL? Because I'm about to shut it down and put it in my computer.
What's that?
Are you going to see The Hobbit?
Oh God, my family lives how'd you know? My family lives TSR. The token, it just, yes. We're going to go see The Hobbit. First night. I got lots of stories about my family and fandom. We go to Dragon Con every year and do costuming. We don't do Lord of the Rings costume because that's our everyday wear.
He's not kidding.
Well then, thank you very much. Yes, thank you. I should have mentioned that.